You know that moment when you're having a perfectly normal conversation with someone, and then it shifts? That moment when one person in the conversation, for whatever reason, decides to say something offensive. It could be personally offensive. No, you look really insert the blank here. It could be politically offensive. That Obama is a real blank, or Trump is blank, or taxes are blank. It could be religiously offensive. God hates blank people. It could be just generally offensive. If it weren't for those blankety blanks, blankety blank. The truth is, the longer we live in the world and have human interaction, the longer we attend family functions, the longer we find ourselves in a big tent kind of a church, the more possibilities there are for offense. Part of having meaningful relationships in the world means opening ourselves up for offense. Part of giving meaning to a relationship means that we give that other person the power to offend. Part of love is risking being hurt. And while we have each, no doubt, come up with our own mechanism for responding to it when it happens to us, the challenge, as we know, is often knowing how to respond when the person is us, when we are the offender, when we're the person who has put our foot in our mouth. But friends, it happens to the best of us. No offense. All of us at some point or another have been in a conversation in which we've thought to ourselves, why did I just say that? When we've kicked ourselves walking away for either doing something or saying something that is offensive. When we've stepped on someone's toes, sometimes we know it in the moment and sometimes it takes a couple decades. But we've all done it, and the fortunate thing is we're not alone. The truth is we come from a long line of offenders. Our faith is filled with really offensive people, present company included. We are all, at some point or another, offensive to someone else. We say something that we don't exactly mean or didn't know exactly how it would come out in the moment, and we kick ourselves for doing it. Fortunately, we can learn from their mistakes. The good news is God didn't leave them alone in the midst of their offensive,ness, which means we get to learn from their mistakes. And so today, on this second week of our Sunday, the second week of a new goal for our church, of inviting other people to experience sanctuary with us and committing on a weekly basis to experience it ourselves, at this beginning of a year of dreams, let's pause for just a moment to make sure that we find the least offensive way forward together. We're aided today by a story of Joseph. The story will be familiar in feel, if not in detail. After all, it's never included in our lectionary. It's the story of Joseph, not the father of Jesus, but the son of Jacob, a story from Genesis. For those who need a little refresher, Joseph was a dreamer. He had many dreams. We're going to stick with Joseph for a couple weeks here as we kick off this season of dreaming to get a sense of what we might learn from him. Joseph was a dreamer, but he didn't always know how to share it in exactly the right way. He was the 11th of 12 children of Jacob, whose name was later changed to Israel. The 11th of those 12 children, his mother was Rachel, who was Jacob's third wife. We'll have to leave that for another sermon, but no doubt offensive. And right before our passage today, Joseph has received a coat of many colors, what we can only imagine was both amazing and technicolored. Right after our passage for today, Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers and is headed for Egypt. Now, typically when we tell this story of Joseph, we skip straight from the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat to his brothers selling him into slavery. And we shake our heads and we wag our fingers at the tenacity of those brothers, at the jealousy of those brothers shipping him off into slavery simply for getting a better coat than they have. But of course, when we read the story, we realize that there's a little more to it than that. After all, the whole reason Joseph was given this amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat was because he was his father's favorite. He was his father's favorite. His father had 11 other sons, and he was his father's favorite. Now, we recognize the kind of pain that can cause from our own experience. Even if it's not about sibling favoritism, we know the kind of pain that can come from looking at what somebody else has and longing to have it. From longing for the kind of intimacy, the kind of connection, the kind of relationship, the kind of love that someone else has, and knowing in our hearts that we don't have it. We long for that kind of connection. And as we know, the greater the distance, the greater the disparity between what someone else has and what we do not, the more offensive it becomes. Certainly, we know this from our work here in Rochester. Friends, we live in a city in which the disparity between those who have and those who have not is offensive. We live in a city in which the difference of a couple of miles means the difference between going to bed full or going to bed hungry. The difference between having a support system or going it alone. The difference between thriving and just surviving. Perhaps the lesson for those of us who long to make a difference in this community, and friends, there are many among us, is that before we dream, we ought to recognize the privilege it is to dream. The gift that we have been given that allows us to dream, the gift of time, the gift of self-reflection, the gift of sanctuary. In other words, as we begin our dreaming this year, we ought to start with humility. Not a feigned humility, as the old saying goes. Humility is like underwear, essential, but in poor taste if it shows. Not feigned humility, but a humility which recognizes the privilege we have been given and commits to not wasting it. Friends, there's nothing wrong with having been given some gifts. It's only wrong if we don't use them. Friends, we have been given gifts to live in this world, gifts to share with this community, gifts that might make a difference here. It begins with humility, but it also comes to recognize that we don't only have grace, that grace is for all of us, that it doesn't matter our zip code, God's grace is for each and every one of us, young and old, black and white, gay and straight, male and female, rich and poor, broken and whole. We are all heirs to God's grace. It begins with humility, it then moves to God's grace, and then it closes with listening. Friends, we need to open our ears to one another. This was a problem for Joseph. He wasn't a particularly good listener. He just blurted out the dream that he had been given with no sense of how it would affect his brothers. He poisoned the relationships because of how unthoughtful he was in sharing his dream. Perhaps those of us who are starting this process of dreaming should do some thinking about really listening for God, listening for each other, and listening for this community. In the words of the Serenity Prayer, we pray that we might not so much seek to be understood as to understand. As we know, it's easier said than done. We might remember the story of the young minister who starts her first day at her new church, and she gets her way through the sermon squinting at her preaching notes, and then finally at the end of the service builds up enough courage to make a suggestion to the congregation. She stands at the front of the chancel and she says, "Friends, I know this is unorthodox, it's my very first day, but I want to share with you a dream I have for this congregation. I dream that we get a new chandelier." And many people in the congregation nod their heads, but there is that one guy in the back who gets red in the face. He gets offended about everything. He stands up and he shouts out, "Preacher, I'm against it. I'm against it for 3 reasons. Number 1, nobody here knows how to spell it. Number 2, nobody here knows how to play it. And number 3, what we really need is more light." Friends, we have to seek to understand, not just to be understood. That is our hope, and it is where Joseph failed. He went straight into this story with his brothers. He says, "Brothers, listen to this dream I had last night." He said, "There we were, binding sheaves in the field like we do. And all of a sudden my sheave rose and stood upright, while your sheaves all came and bowed down to me." Isn't that a wonderful dream he shares with his brothers? It's like saying, "Brothers, gather around. I dreamed, and in my dream I was reminded how much better I am than all of you. Don't you love this dream?" And as if that weren't bad enough, he goes on running straight through it, putting his foot further into his mouth by gathering now his father around and his brothers and saying, "Listen to this next dream I had. There's the sun and the moon and 11 stars, and they're all bowing down to me." And again, in this place, the father rebukes him, and his brothers get even more angry. It says they hated him more. Now, surely this was a device used by the author to foreshadow that which was to come. Those of us who have read ahead, and we will focus on this a little bit in the couple weeks ahead, know that Joseph went down to Egypt, and there, sure enough, came a time when his brothers and his father had to come and bow down to him to get grain. At no point in the story, though, does Joseph recognize just how crazy that dream would sound to his brothers. He just keeps going. But even if he doesn't recognize his offense, we can. If nothing else, friends, this passage reminds us that we do not dream in a vacuum. That our dreams, whether we like it or not, for better or worse, affect the people around us. We are spending this year as a congregation dreaming. Some of you have already written on the dream board, and some of you will in the days and weeks and months ahead. We encourage all those dreams. It's one way, only one, in which we're listening for the dreams of this congregation. But let us not forget that our dreams affect other people. That our dreams, especially the dreams we have for making a better community, have to be vetted with the community. That part of dreaming is about recognizing with some humility that our dreams might not be the best dreams. We have to be willing to, even though we've dreamed a really good dream, to let go of it for the sake of our neighbor. There is no greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. It just might be that now is not the right time for our particular dream. But that shouldn't stop us from dreaming. Friends, the church, the Christian church, has historically been pretty poor at shifting our dreams. Throughout the centuries, we have never lacked for dreams, but we have lacked for humility. Throughout the centuries, the Christian church has never lacked for words, but it has lacked for listening ears. Throughout the centuries, the Christian church has never lacked for truth, but it has lacked for grace, not from God, but for each other. We can do a lot of damage if we are unable or unwilling to admit when we're wrong. We don't have to look very far today to see where the church continues to hurt people, to see where the church fails to live into the gospel dream that was set before it. A dream which recognizes the grace in God in each and every one of our brothers and sisters, with no caveats, no exceptions. A church which fails to have humility, fails to love. It's a story of a man getting near the end of his life who goes to an old monk and he says, "I've tried all my life and I'm wondering still, how do I find humility?" And the monk, after thinking about it for a moment, says to the man, "Well, the audacity of humility is this. That is, the risk of humility is this: being the first person to say, 'I love you.'" Friends, as we dream, let us dream with humility. Let us not be afraid to make mistakes and admit where we're wrong, but most of all, above anything else, let us remember that when we come to a place of doubt, when we come to a place where we have questions, let us err on the side of love. Let us lead with love. If we could do that, we just might change this world of ours. No offense. Amen.